Welcome to the Season 2 finale of the Everything is a Primary Source podcast, the show where we get to know history through analyzing pop culture. We've covered a lot this season, everything from TV game shows to museums, neo-Western movies to trading cards, and so much else in between. Lives and careers have also been analyzed this season, which makes this episode a perfect bookend, as my guest's path in life was inspired by a significant moment in pop music history. Dr. Kitty Oliver cites her experience seeing the Beatles at the Gator Bowl in the 1960s as the event that changed everything for her. The Fab Four, from Liverpool's arrival to the Sunshine State during their famous 1964 U.S. tour, marked a momentous change not only for her, but for the state of Florida as well. The Beatles, standing by their convictions and refusing to play to a segregated audience, made all the difference to my guest, as that night's events propelled her into a new world and its possibilities. I'd like to welcome you back to the Everything is a Primary Source podcast. I'm Eric Paul, and today I'm being joined by Dr. Kitty Oliver. Dr. Oliver is an author. She's a storyteller, an oral historian. She is a musician. She is a producer. She is a great many things, and today she's my guest on the Everything is a Primary Source podcast. So welcome, Dr. Kitty Oliver, to the show. Thank you for joining.
Thank you for having me.
So this is the situation that I have found myself in a few times, where as a teacher, as an educator, I'm showing something to my class. I incorporate a lot of media in my class, especially documentaries, and I'm very particular about the documentaries I show. I make sure that they are, well produced and well researched and really, the highest caliber that you can have. And I was showing the segment from the 8 Days a Week documentary that Ron Howard made about the Beatles during the touring years. And the segment that I always show focuses on your tale of being in Florida in 1964. Is it 64? When they came to the Gator Bowl.
Yes.
And how that was a landmark moment in your life. And so as I'm watching that, I'm like typing away on my, because I have split screen. I can show the documentary up here, and I said, I'm going to send that email out because I think that would be just a wonderful person to have their story told on my show. So, before we go into anything else, what was that like to be asked to be part of that documentary?
Well, that was a wonderfully surreal experience that I keep reliving because I get requests for interviews from time to time, and the Beatles fandom, phenomenon spans so many countries. So that documentary continues to come up, and people are interested in the story. It was an interesting situation that brought me to the filming, because from what I understand, they had found that contract that the Beatles signed that in Jacksonville, Florida, before appearing, but in the contract, they stipulated that they would not perform if the audience was segregated. Mm-hmm. And that was pretty groundbreaking at that time. And because of that, and they took the stand at a press conference, and it caused a lot of consternation. But in the end, the city did bow to that. And at the same time, I was growing up in Jacksonville, dealing with the segregated experience, becoming aware of things opening and changing in terms of the desegregation that was coming, and the Civil Rights Act that was proposed and had been passed.
Right.
And I was a Beatles fan, a
right.
beloved fan of radio and listening to music, and radio had opened the world to me, beyond that segregated environment I was living in, to hear quote unquote white music, and then to also hear the Beatles, and coming from England, and that whole cultural experience that was so different from ours in America. So I wanted to see the show, and I found out how I could get tickets, and then bought tickets, and I went alone. And my first concert, but also an integrated experience, and my first time really being around white people, in the sense that, yes, people lived, there were white and black people and growing up in the community, but we lived so separately in an apartheid kind of situation that to a large degree, you certainly didn't have many encounters, and you avoided them if you could, and certainly not sitting in a seat between, sitting between these people who were so different and all. So it was an experience I had, and I was invited to share on a podcast when a reporter had found that contract. And I didn't ever see the interview, but I discovered later on that it was out there in the internet world, and Ron Howard and the production team thought that it would be so really great if they could find someone who had attended the concert.
Yeah.
And someone on the production staff said, I don't know, I thought I saw something, in something about someone named Kitty, and that was all they had to go. And as a result of that, they did a search, and because I had written about growing up in Jacksonville during that era in my memoir and all, they found me, called me. So the call comes and says, hello, I'm with Ron Howard, and he would like for you to be interviewed in this film. And I'm going, what? And I'm here in Florida. Can we fly you out to California for the interview? And so they flew me and my husband out, and I did that interview that you saw, and I was one of the next to the last people who were interviewed. And Ron Howard came in and during makeup to say, thank you so much for doing this. He said, this is really going to make the film. And to find out after all of that, when the film premiered in London, and they brought me out there to walk the red carpet, which was the blue carpet, and to be there with Paul and Ringo and their families, and George's family, and others who'd been part of that whole extension of the Beatles experience. And to have that segment you saw come on camera there, and have them all sitting there applauding as a result of it. Talk about a fan's journey, journey in music being so wonderful, but to see how much it meant to them, because I had the chance then to talk with them later in the party afterwards. The Kitty, they said. And I'm saying thank you for the stand you took, because it opened a door for me. And they were saying thank you for sharing this and reminding us of something that we did so long ago. And then they wanted to share their feelings about racial relations.
Yeah. It's incredible that happened, because, I mean, it's like you became connected and then disconnected and then back. I mean, just the almost like tiny strings wrapped around the earth, and you ran into each other in 1964, and then you had an effect on each other then, but then were separated by time and space for a long, and then found each other again, and just kind of did another check-in and be like, okay, well, this is what you did for me and what I did for you, and this is just incredible. And that's just, if anybody's looking for the meaning of life, that's it. That's what the meaning of life is all about, is like enriching each other's lives in some way. And the Beatles, I think, as pop musicians, have always had that ability, and they have done that for countless people. But to have that moment for them, I think is just incredible, because as that documentary does a great job showing, their entire tour schedule, those years that they toured, were so arduous. It was such a one show after another, screaming fans after it got so much that they just stopped altogether. They said, we're not doing it anymore. But every city they went to all around the world, there are millions of people such as yourselves that had that moment. And then your ability to talk and go right to them and say, this is what you did. That must have been just fantastic.
It felt really good on my part to be able to say that, but I was certainly so touched by them feeling as connected. And as a result of our lives encountering each other in that way, the work I do with race and ethnic relations and bridging cultures they learned about and very generously supported me using the video segment in my presentations. And then I was contacted because Ringo does a concert for charity on television every year on his birthday, celebrating his birthday with other musicians. And I was contacted to say, hey, you might want to know that Ringo's going to show the segment from the documentary, your segment.
That's so funny.
So, so every time, just periodically, there's some little ripple that shows up.
Now, pop music, I think, I do a lot of episodes about music, and I think that's because, and you are a musician as well, so you can definitely speak to this. As far as the different kinds of media and that you can produce quickly, I think music seems to has the quickest turnaround time. And what I mean by that is, like, if I want to express my opinions about something and I write a book, that could take months, sometimes years. If I want to make a movie, again, that's a very long process. But if I want to make a song, it's basically poetry with music, I can do that conceivably. There's plenty of artists have done it in 30 minutes, right? And just kind of turn around. Or even in the live section, if I was watching a play and the actors just stopped the play and started to improvise and, get real time, I think most of the audience would be pretty upset. Like, what are you doing? Like, that you're going off script. But if I'm at a live concert, I'm actually kind of upset if the band doesn't react to the crowd somehow and doesn't talk to me or say, oh, you like this, we came up with a special song just for you. So do you feel that way in all the things that you do to express your ideas and opinions about things? Does music, is that the quickest way to see a reflection of contemporary values and ideas?
I think music very definitely has a way of touching people and of moving people at a visceral level. And for the work I do, which is trying to talk about some of these very difficult human issues we have about how we deal with differences and how we interact with each other and how we can better express our humanity in negotiating differences, I found that music becomes an avenue of opening people up to begin to listen to and think about and talk about some difficult subjects. Mm-hmm. So if I look back at my history and growing up, the world I lived in was very prescribed in one way within the Black culture, but music from other cultures opened up the world for me because I began to see that there were people who didn't look like me, but were talking about and singing about things that supported the world and supported me becoming, and people like me becoming part of the larger world. And that was a very, important step for me and for many people in opening our minds that we were not alone in the social justice struggle.
Right.
that there were people who were not Black who saw this as being important and who were raising their voice and were putting their careers on the line and were creating songs and spurring, movements as a result of that. So the Beatles, in terms of the international aspect of this movement, were important to me in that way. Bob Dylan, and hearing Dylan for the first time during that same period of
Mm-hmm.
1964, I met some people with the Unitarian Universalist congregation who were beginning to be engaged in social activism and protest and all. And they invited me over. And I remember hearing this weird, gravelly, strange, bizarre, how many rounds? What is this? But it was so compelling
Yeah.
because he was talking, that urgency of him talking about things that were different and being introduced to Pete Seeger and folk music and Peter, Paul, and Mary who were doing that. And later on, once I got to college, I began singing folk music.
Mm-hmm.
Starting out at a folk club and then doing folk rock jazz and singing some Beatles songs and singing some of other white artists that I'd heard. So music just has that power by being able to put it in that form that's accessible.
Yeah.
Not only accessible to the heart, but accessible to those other musicians like me to pick up and use and make it our own.
My question for you, though, is in that era, what kind of radio stations were playing Beatles? What radio stations were playing the rock music? Because we have rock channels now, we have oldies channels now, but I'm just trying to fix myself in the early '60s. Where could you hear the Beatles?
Well, in the early '60s, the radio stations were segregated to begin with. And so the AM station is what we listened to. And there was a Black AM station that played gospel music at certain times of the day. And then it played R&B music at other times. So we were listening mostly to that. But we had what was like a mega station, the Big Ape radio station that had the most power, so that the Big Eight station played on through the night, whereas the AM station, the Black station, as we called it, stopped at a certain time. I don't know if it was 7, 8 o'clock or whatever. So at night, after I had done homework and when I probably should have been sleeping, I had a transistor radio and I could tune in and get the Big Ape radio. And if you dialed very carefully, like safe cracking almost, but you could get it. And that's where I heard the Beatles. And that's where I heard, just a slew of other white musicians playing at the time. I remember the Big Ape even had a contest where they were giving away the Rubber Soul album, and you had to write why, in so many words, why I love the Beatles or who my favorite Beatle is. I don't remember what it was, but as a budding writer, even then at that age, I sent in my entry and I won. Supposedly autographed album. Rubber Soul album, somebody wrote across it, but anyway,
block letters, Paul McCartney.
The Big Eight was that central spot where you heard rock music, where you heard that, and then of course seeing the movies, because at that time there were so many movies out that had the white rock and roll artists doing little cameos and all. And once in a while, there'd be a Black performer as well. But that's how I became familiar with the music. And I was really an oddball in my community, very much so, because I was listening to both.
Mm-hmm. And hearing, the similarities probably between the two of them. Now, I may sound very naive right now, but it just sounds odd to me to say a segregated radio stations. Because I guess I understand. I don't understand, but I can see the concept of the employees, but the idea of being able to segregate once it goes in the airwaves, I feel like it's whoever is bringing it in can listen to whatever they want. But I guess that just speaks to the way things were in that time and place. That you actually had is even all the way down to the media that you could participate in was segregated. That is just is foreign to me, and I'm hoping that that's you see that as an achievement that it's foreign to me. Somebody who was born in the '80s, is just it's unheard of. Um, Talking about the civil rights movement, so the modern civil rights movement, anyway, the one it goes back to Brown versus Board of Education. So that's the case that overturns Plessy versus Ferguson and says separate but equal is unequal. And that sets in motion the bus boycotting and the sit-ins and the marches and everything like that. Growing up in that era and experiencing segregation in the early part of your life, was the Brown decision a big deal to you then? Did people talk about it at all, or was it just kind of in the background?
Growing up in Jacksonville during that era, I don't think I had any awareness of the Brown decision because we had separate schools, all black schools. So through elementary, junior high, it was called then, and senior high, this is where we operated. I mean, we had our chorus, we had theater activities. We just operated in that separate world, but there was an awareness by the mid 60s that things were beginning to change, that the civil rights movement was escalating. But let me just explain a little bit about what it was living separately that way, because I'd like to
Sure.
just point out to people that it we had a library within the schools, but we had a very limited number of books. We had books like other students got at other schools, other white schools, but the books were used, and often the books would have pages torn out, or there'd be other names on them. So the separate but equal so-called policy was not working on so many levels, and even
Right.
at the most fundamental of saying you're getting the materials and therefore things are equal. We knew it wasn't equal. The teachers knew we're not getting what other schools are getting. They found ways to work around it and try to supplement and to give us what we needed, and also to prepare us for a world that was changing in order for us to go into an integrated setting so that we could get access to the things we weren't getting under the bogus separate but equal
Yeah, that's
policy. So I remember, for instance, in '64, that pivotal year with the Beatles experience and other things going on, going to the White Library for the first time as a result of the Civil Rights Act, and
yeah.
people knowing that that was coming. So they had to open that library up to people like me for the first time, and going and seeing all these books that were available. And I was a reader and loved books and a writer, and finding James Baldwin on the shelves, all of his works, finding other writers, and just being able to check out as many books as I wanted. So the world was opening up. So when you talk about living in segregation, and then the civil rights movement, and then the experience of having your life change as a result, that's been my historical journey, being able to see how things were when they were closed
Yeah.
down, and then how they began to open up, and also experiencing what it was like being very much like an immigrant having to go in this new society that opened up as a result.
Was there any kind of difficulties in those opening stages of integration? Did you have any experiences where people were, not the friendliest about it, maybe?
I was one of the first Black freshmen to enter the University of Florida. And that was a big step in 1965. And even though I traveled only 90 miles, not very far from Jacksonville, it was a journey like coming from another country, another world to move in there. First time actually being around white people in a continual way and living in the dorm and having to interact, after curfew and all, and being in the large classrooms and being the only Black person there throughout most of that experience of those 4 years. And as I tell people, often the stories about the attacks and the fear and the physical danger that people are in are the stories that we hear, and they need to be told, and they're very real of that terror. Mm-hmm. But there's also these little subtle breaking down of your sense of self-esteem and confidence that occur. Today, society has a term for it, and they'll call it the microaggressions.
Yeah.
But it's those little things that I dealt with and really had to grow from. Walking across the campus and being totally ignored. And having to build a wall around yourself so that knowing that you'd be going to these environments, you didn't know how you're going to be perceived or reacted to. So you close yourself in a way in order to survive. Mm-hmm. There weren't activities for Blacks because there were only 35 Blacks total, they figured, and that included graduate students and upper division students, and there were 5 of us freshmen living on campus, and 1 person left after the first semester. And it was only slowly by the time I graduated that there were more Blacks coming in, and a Black student union movement began, and rallying for Black studies and all of that. So we're talking about a period before that when there were no alliances to call on. Right. So having to build up your own identity, to have your identity broken down and having to build up a new identity was probably the biggest struggle that I faced. And I'll just give you one example that I wrote about because it was so pivotal. Living in that dorm the first year and getting adjusted to the girls, and I did have the only other, my randomly selected roommate was the only other Black girl who came in as a freshman.
Yeah.
She and I had absolutely nothing in common. So different lifestyle backgrounds and all that. But by the second year, I had begun to get comfortable, and I was a big sister writing to an incoming freshman, and you were to show the freshman around when she came to campus. And the freshman was white, of course, and she came and I showed her around. And anyway, over that year, that first semester, we became friendly enough and started talking. And she told me, she said, I really want to tell you something. She said, when I got to campus and I saw that you were my big sister, you were the one who had been writing to me, she said, I was disgusted. She said, I really, and she said, and you invited me out to dinner, probably pizza, something that day, that evening. And I didn't go because I was ashamed to be seen with you. And she said, but I want you to know that I'm not ashamed now. I would go with you anywhere. Mm-hmm. And when you are confronted with things like that, how do you react? Because you've got a choice to just move backward and say, see, I was trying to be good. I thought we had a relationship. I thought we had gotten past this race thing, and now you're telling me this. Yeah. Or you're telling me this because you're telling me something very important, that you had changed, a shift had occurred. You were aware, of something
Yeah.
happening here. And it became a profound lesson that really led me to the work I began to do, because there was more to this than just opening the doors and seeing what happens. People had to change and had to shift in ways I don't think we thought about it when
Yeah.
a law like Brown versus,
Right.
evolved out of Brown versus Board of Education, or the Civil Rights Act. A law went into effect that dealing with people and people's attitudes and hearts was much more profound work.
Because she was dealing with it in her own way. She was adjusting to the changes that were happening. When preparing for this interview, I was thinking about this. I'm like, there are things that no matter how high in society our status becomes, we can't control. There's just things that are just, it's just the climate of a time period or a place or both, and we can't control it. We can only react to it. We can only respond to it. But then there are things that we can control, and that's our own, what we produce ourselves, our own words, our writing, our songs, or all that expression. And it's like that entire era of the 50s into the 60s. This is the baby boomers are the ones who are, and I don't think it's a coincidence. I don't think it's coincidence at all, because you have this huge generation, like a gigantic generation, and it's only inevitable that with so many of them that they're going to affect some kind of social change, that there's going to be, so even if there hadn't been the actual Supreme Court case that made that designation, it just seems like it was the nature of this large group of people, these people growing up in a new era. And, the 60s were it. I think they've become romanticized in some ways. They've also gone the other way. A lot of people kind of put the 60s as an entire era of just unrest. But when you speak to people who lived through it, such as yourself, you see that it was more of just like, it seemed like just a special time of change. It was not to overstate Bob Dylan's words, but the times were a changing. I think everybody said that about the 60s. It's kind of the theme song for the decade. But do you think there's anything to that way of thinking, that it was that the reason that you were able to have those experiences and then it results in the work that you've done since that era is because of the generation that you were born in?
Oh, I think the generational influence was absolutely paramount in everything they went through, because there was such a large number of people going through similar things, but there were also so many things happening at the same time. I mean, on so many fronts, whether, racially, with women's rights, and with um, and with the war,
Yeah, the
and
anti-war movement
against
and
war. I mean, and assassinations and political change, and there were all these things being thrown at us as we were coming of age, and then going into adulthood and having to grapple with. I guess I don't romanticize it, because I wish I I think there are parts of my generation that really lost sight of what it is to be an elder. I think we could have been better. We could have held on to a lot more of what we experienced, and if we had processed it better, to be better elders to the younger people now and supportive of them. But many of us are doing that and are trying to do that. The music that you like to talk about has remained so important, I think, as at the core of the spirit of the generation. Some of
Yeah.
the politics and the social um, policies and behaviors and all that we may have lost, over time, sadly. but there still is so much of the importance of the music that's there that brings us back to that feeling and can anchor us again. And so many of the musicians, and I think that's why there's so many of them, so many of us who are still out there.
Yeah.
Still making music, still doing new things, still working with other musicians, and when you see that, people working cross-culturally with other musicians around the world and different cultures, and working with younger musicians and trying to show that that spirit is still there and
Yeah.
continue.
Passing the torch along in so many ways and lighting it as you go. Kitty Oliver had such a unique experience in the 1960s because she grew up in segregation, saw and participated in the changes to society as they were happening, and embraced how things would be different as time went on. The music of the era is a reflection of the way her and so many of her peers' lives were altered as rock and roll itself graduated and fragmented into a kaleidoscope of sounds from the start of the decade to the end. This could be true just for the Beatles themselves. Even if the baby boomer generation was not actively thinking that they were going to change the way the country would look and operate, so much of the popular culture from that era proves that such changes were underway. And, as Dr. Oliver indicates, pop music acted as not only the soundtrack for the baby boomers' youth, but inspiration for the rest of their lives as well. There's so much more on the second half of the program, and if you want to hear it a few months early, go on over to Substack or Patreon and find the EPS podcast. Once you've become a subscriber or patron, you'll have access to this and so many other second parts of podcasts well before this summer's Part 2 Palooza begins. If you'd like to learn more about Dr. Kitty Oliver and her work, please visit kittyoliveronline.com. I hope you've enjoyed this season of the Everything is a Primary Source podcast as much as I've enjoyed hosting and producing it. I'd like to thank everyone who helped make it happen, from the many guests that contributed their time and expertise to the venues who welcomed me in to put on my live podcast karaoke events. But I especially want to thank you, the listeners. Be sure to subscribe to the Substack newsletter at epspodcast.substack.com to keep up with news in the off-season. Be sure to follow the show on social media, especially Instagram. Until next time, thank you for listening to the EPS podcast, where everything is a primary source and everyone has a story to tell.